I'm Naomi Braine. I'm a professor of sociology at the City University of New York. I'm at both Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center. A lot of my work is focused on the intersections of social movements and public health. So I got into it from being a needle exchange activist before it was fashionable or entirely legal, shall we say, and then moved into, as I went to graduate school and whatnot, moved into doing research on harm reduction and drug use and HIV, and then in about 2015, got into some conversations about self-managed abortion, which led to the research that became part of this book on self-managed abortion as a global feminist movement, primarily looking at the work of activists in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and in parts of Europe. But as I was writing the book, doing the research and then writing the book, self-managed abortion was becoming more of an issue within the United States and was starting to be not really a visible phenomenon yet, but starting to move into public consciousness, particularly through quasi-self-managed abortion through telemedicine. And then while I was writing the book, I was about 3/4 of the way through the first draft and the Dobbs decision dropped. In fact, I was negotiating the contract with Verso when SB 8 passed in Texas, and then Dobbs dropped into the middle of the first draft. And I had to do a few more interviews to, kind of bring it up to date as things were moving extremely quickly. And they have continued to move extremely quickly. And I am, in an ongoing way, as both a feminist activist and a sociologist of public health, I'm connected to some of the ongoing emerging work around self-managed abortion in the US. So I think that one of the fascinating things in thinking about the election and abortion specifically is that there were 5 states in which abortion measures were on the ballot and they got more than 50% of the vote. By abortion measures, I mean, I should be more clear, I mean measures to protect access to abortion and often contraception as well, in many cases by writing it into the state constitution. Right, so there were 5 states where those got over 50% of the vote, and Trump won by a significant margin. So some meaningful percentage of people voted for both that ballot measure and for Trump in order to get the outcomes that we're seeing. So, I think part of it is that people have no understanding of the relationship between federal and state law. So they thought, oh, I can vote for Trump, and if I vote for this, my reproductive rights are safe. Right? If the feds decide, if the federal government decides to pass an abortion ban, that overrides state law, including state constitutions. So you cannot protect yourself from a federal ban. And I had to explain this to my students in my classes at Brooklyn College because for the most part they had no understanding. They were like, well, the federal government's going to have to change the Constitution of the United States if they want to ban abortion because, that the Supreme Court will have, and I was like, no, Civics 101, that's not how it works. But nobody gets Civics 101. Well, not anymore, or very few people do. So there was a lack of understanding of what choices they were actually making. There are, I'm sure, some people who heard Trump try to walk it back and say he was not interested in a federal abortion ban and that he wants it to be up to the states. Those people were listening to Trump but not to Vance, since Vance made his position crystal clear. And they somehow managed to just skip over all of the sexism that spewed out of Trump's mouth. So I think that it did not have the turnout effect that the Democrats were hoping for. And that's partly because of, the ways the states divide to begin with. right? Blue states are reliably blue states have protected abortion already. Reliably red states weren't, there's a sort of more of an acceptance, I think, or less of a sense of empowerment, though we do have those anomalous 5 states, which for those who are curious are Missouri, Arizona, and Arizona is arguably, a swing state at this point. Missouri isn't. Nevada, Montana, and in Florida, it got more than 50% of the vote, but didn't reach a 60% threshold. So, and those are states where you saw a lot of mix-up, right? Trump won, and so did Ruben Gallego. So there's a deep ambivalence within the US electorate, and I think it played out around this. I think the first thing we're going to see is that any state with a Republican governor and legislature that hasn't put in some elevated restrictions will. We're going to see all the action is going to be at the state level, I think, at first. And, it depends on, so in terms of the possibilities of federal restrictions or a federal ban, we need to pay attention to language, right? Because we don't want any law going in at the federal level that says anything negative about abortion, full stop, right? We want the feds to keep their mouth shut, since we assume that under a Republican administration, they're not going to open their mouth in a desirable way. So we want them to keep their mouth shut. If they open it, we need to pay attention to exactly what happens, right? Because across the states that have imposed restrictions in the wake of Dobbs, right, we see bans at 15 weeks, bans after 15 weeks, bans after 12 weeks, bans after 6 weeks, and pretty much total bans. There isn't much difference between a 6-week ban and a total ban. Just realistically speaking, most people don't know they're pregnant at 6 weeks, or they're just starting to figure it out. And if there is a 6-week ban in the state, you have to get out of state in order to get an abortion. Or you have to get pills to arrive. But if you're getting pills, then the finer points of exactly how pregnant you are at 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks, you're not asking anyone's permission, at least not anyone in your state. 12 weeks and 15 weeks create wildly different levels of opportunity than 0 to 6, right? Because the majority of abortions occur in the first 12 weeks. So a state that bans abortion after 12 weeks, if they really allow it as a woman's choice or a pregnant person's choice up until 12 weeks, there will still be clinics in the state. It will still be possible to obtain an abortion in state, right? And those are key because the majority of people make that decision before 12 weeks. If they can get to a clinic relatively easily, maybe with a little help from an abortion fund, they're okay. 15 weeks expands it a little bit more, though the 15-week bans are less common. Usually it's 12 weeks or we're not going to really weigh in until viability. The federal government could, if they decide to go down this path, they could go down it at any one of those markers. I think 15 weeks is unlikely because that's sort of idiosyncratic, just to be real. That was the law that Dobbs was based on, was a 15-week ban, but a 15-week ban was what a state put in order to push the boundaries of Roe. Right, so my guess is that if they go for something that isn't a heartbeat bill, which is the 6 weeks, then they would go for a first trimester, end of first trimester, which would be horrifying, and it would be horrifying. Women would die. People with problem pregnancies in particular would die. Doctors would be freaked out about what they can do. We would have that situation where somebody's bleeding out in an emergency room and the doctor wants to call the lawyer before they do anything, which is not good medicine. but they're terrorized. So it would be a regime of terror, right? Even a 12-week ban would be a regime of terror inflicted on people who can get pregnant and on medical providers. You know, one of the things that very few people who don't spend a lot of time thinking about abortion are really aware of is what happens when you legislate abortion, right? That I think most people, including most people who are in favor of abortion, who want to see it decriminalized, who want to see general access, who have no issues with it whatsoever, if you ask them what is an abortion, they'll look at you first like you're nuts, and then they'll say something along the lines of, well, it's when somebody decides to end their pregnancy because they don't want to be pregnant, which is, or because the pregnancy was an accident or something like that. And that's most people's understanding, sort of common sense understanding of an abortion. Now, 99%, probably 100% of miscarriage care falls under the heading of abortion. There is no difference. Nix the 99%. There is no difference between a miscarriage and an abortion. The only difference is the question of how it began. Otherwise, you have, when doctors talk about it, or if you're speaking Spanish that doesn't have a word for miscarriage, it's aborto, right? In Spanish, you have aborto inducido and aborto espontáneo, right? Spontaneous abortion, induced abortion. And doctors make a pretty similar distinction in English. But we have this word miscarriage in English that sort of tidies the situation up and pretends that there are things that are separate. That's a miscarriage, it's not an abortion. A miscarriage is something that happens spontaneously. An abortion in English is something that happens intentionally. Medically, they're not very different. You know, when my sister-in-law had a spontaneous miscarriage in the first trimester, her doctor was like, don't worry about it. You're fine. There was something wrong with that pregnancy. But if she had needed medical treatment, it would have been the same medical treatment as for a medication treatment or perhaps a D&C of an early abortion, because it was, I forget how many weeks she was, but it was first trimester. This is, when you ban abortion care, you ban miscarriage care, right? And many of those people who have been the court cases and women who have been in crisis and gone into sepsis in emergency rooms, some of those, two of those that I know of, resulted from very rare complications of abortion. All of the others that I am aware of resulted from miscarriages, from something going wrong in a pregnancy. And they turned up in an emergency room bleeding, and somebody went into a panic attack because what they were going to have to do was a D&C, which is considered an abortion procedure under these bans. It's also care for a miscarriage, particularly a second or third trimester miscarriage. And, and that is another, other pieces of this that people don't really understand is that people need abortions as abortions through the second and into the third trimester. A third trimester abortion is essentially a tragedy. I used to have a friend who's since passed away who did late abortions. She was one of half a dozen people in the United States who did late abortions. And she would say, that a third trimester abortion is a tragedy. That was a wanted baby. Right? It's not it's a tragedy for the pregnant person and for whoever else was involved aspirationally in wanting that child. There may be extraordinarily rare other circumstances, but nothing I've ever heard of. right? So there are third trimester abortions. There are late second trimester abortions. And those occur for a wide variety of reasons, but the most common ones are the health of the mother, a complication of the pregnancy, a baby that has died in the womb for whatever reason, a baby with anencephaly who will be born, without part of their skull and their brain, these sort of horrifying situations. And somebody wanted that. Somebody had named that child possibly in their mind. And all of these bans put that person in a situation, somebody who's dealing with a health emergency or somebody who's dealing with some other kind of emergency, takes a horrible situation and makes it worse. And it has nothing to do with all of the Republican talking points and pro-life talking points about irresponsible teenagers, college students, and young adults. Most people who have abortions already have children. The majority already have children. What are we really going to be dealing with, and how to respond? That's a huge question that the movement is struggling with. Different aspects of the movement is struggling with at the moment. So I think I can offer some of the questions that are in play to which nobody has very many answers yet, right? So it will depend on what Congress does, right? Does Congress actually pass a ban of any kind? If so, what do they pass? Do the Democrats even try to put up a fight? Like, the Senate Democrats are lousy at using the filibuster. The Republicans are excellent at it. Will the Democrats actually filibuster? Will they, which would open up space for really visible resistance before something passes. And the majority of the US population supports access to abortion. So, particularly if Republicans try to pass a ban at less than 12 weeks. 12 weeks would be a struggle point, a really complicated thing. But, a 6-week ban, a heartbeat ban, something like that, if the Democrats can open space for there to be public resistance, I think there would probably be something closer to what we saw in response to the Muslim ban, right? When people were really like, wait a minute, what? Especially as somebody starts to inform them what that really means. So there is the possibility of real sort of popular resistance if anything moves forward federally, particularly if we have time to mobilize public resistance. Anything will get tied up in the courts to the whatever extent that's possible, but nobody should count on that as really solving any problems, especially given who's in the courts these days, who the judges are. State level stuff is much harder. As I said, so that there will be state level responses. So the legislative and policy thing is, I think, going to be a moving target, especially for the first 2 years. And, typically what happens at the midterms is that the party that's in power loses some seats, at which point, the dice change. The loading of the dice changes. We'll see what happens with that. I think that immigrants are probably at the top of the immediate action list. Not abortion per se. But the discussion around abortion and the feds also needs to be expanded into a reproductive justice frame. Because there's a lot of things that the federal government can do and that the Trump administration or the incoming aspirational Trump folks and Project 2025 are talking about doing that do not directly target abortion. They don't include the word abortion, but they would have a horrific impact on reproductive health and reproductive justice, right? So there's a lot of talk about restricting Medicaid. 50% of kids in the country are on Medicaid, some version of Medicaid and children's health insurance, right? A significant percentage of people who can become pregnant are on Medicaid. Medicaid, the federal part of Medicaid doesn't cover abortions to begin with. So for most people, messing with Medicaid is not an abortion-related issue unless you're in a state like New York or California. But Medicaid covers an enormous amount of prenatal care. It covers birthing expenses. It covers a whole set of things that somebody who is pregnant and doesn't have money needs. It covers birth control, right? So all of these things may get rolled back without anybody ever saying the word abortion. And that will have a catastrophic effect on people's health. So I think that in the first 2 years, especially, we need, in thinking about we need to think about reproductive justice, not abortion. And we need to keep our eye on balls like Medicaid, like Title X, which funds family planning, like different versions of different gag rules that affect what you can say, which may not be exclusively about abortion. We need to keep an eyeball on what happens to the ability of teenagers to get health care without their parents getting a phone call. You know, there's a lot of teenage girls who get birth control without ever having anybody having a conversation with their parents, and that's a very good thing because most teenagers are starting to be sexually active. So really, it's better for them not to get pregnant. You know, these are, I think, the parts that will be moved because most people don't understand what's being talked about. You know, the intricacies of Medicaid, you have to be on it. And even if you're on it, you don't necessarily know the details about what piece they're moving. You may know they're making it harder for you to renew or that you've lost your eligibility. You may show up and hope it will pay for, assume it will pay for something and find out it won't, right? But the bills that's going through Congress are going to be really obscure. The decisions that are made by HHS, and I'm not going to get into his current appointee, his nominees, because he's blowing hot air right now. You know, we don't know what's going to happen. We can assume they will all be terrible. The details of terrible are TBD, and I'm not going to obsess about, I'm not going to obsess about the clown show that is currently being paraded as his cabinet nominees. You know, there's a whole other side of movement organizing, which is the reason why the number of abortions in the United States has not dropped since Dobbs. It may even have increased. So a fair number of states have made it really difficult to get an abortion. And I'm sure there are people, there's some data out of Texas that suggests that, you know, there have been what epidemiologists call excess births, a higher number of births than anticipated in Texas after SB 8, starting, as one might expect, 7 months after a 6-week ban. We start to see an increase in births. But in the country as a whole, there has been no change or even a slight increase in the number of abortions. So people what we know about abortion is that if somebody has an unwanted pregnancy, they will get rid of it. That has been true for a very long time. Long before abortion outside of the medical system was safe. If somebody had an unwanted pregnancy, they would do their best to change that situation. And now you can change it with a handful of pills. and a half page of instructions. So, and what will happen with mifepristone is an open question, and I recognize that, but some data from the first 6 to 8 months post-Dobbs, so essentially the rest of 2022, after the Dobbs decision dropped, indicated that not only did abortions not decrease, but that 60% of abortion pills were being obtained through community networks. And by definition, the FDA is not controlling what happens in community networks. Community networks do not work with prescriptions usually. These are autonomous, independent, grassroots sharing of and circulation of medication, right? And so that data suggests, and there is other data that suggests that there are very active community-based networks that are helping people access medication and instruction and providing support. And it's coming from all over the place. And people are using it without any increase in the number of complications that are turning up in emergency rooms, which is the real bottom line on how safe it is. So that is a central piece of the movements. That will be the expansion of those kinds of community networks is going to be a major part of the movement's work going forward. So in the wake of the 6-week ban in Texas in September of 2021, cross-border networks started to form, primarily at that stage, Mexico, Texas. But they quickly spread through much of the rest of the US. And, you know, the statement out of the networks of acompañamiento in Latin America, and that is a form, acompañamiento or accompaniment in English is a kind of activism that I talk about a lot in this book. But it's, you know, it is a strategy, a form of communal healthcare, community-based, outside the medical system, mutual aid, solidarity aid, solidarity action, developed by women in Latin America. Adaptations of it exist in other parts of the world. Anywhere where abortion has been banned, accompaniment exists in one form or another. And these are the networks that activists have created to support each other, to share knowledge and information as they support people who need abortions. And the message in the wake of first SB 8 and then Dobbs, the message out of Latin America was that they will accompany an abortion anywhere in the Americas, from the Southern Cone to Nova Scotia. It does not matter where you live, they are here for you. And, you know, and given the way the internet works and the way WhatsApp works and Signal and these other internet-based communication apps, that's not an idle statement, right? That in fact, you can accompany abortions, provide support and information to someone from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world. And, you know, this is happening in various ways within the United States. There has been a crash course of learning from our sisters in Latin America, and also from those of us in the US who have had ties to activists in Latin America. And there were cross-border ties before SB 8. That was part of what enabled it to take root so quickly. I mean, a few months after SB 8, you know, I remember getting a communication from somebody saying, hey, there's going to be an online meeting, you know, about cross-border support. Do you want to be part of it? Because I was tied in on both sides of the border to folks. So These mobilize quickly, they are spreading, and there's an ongoing process of figuring out what accompaniment looks like in the United States. What is possible? How can we use shield laws for as long as they exist? How do we create grassroots level networks? What is going to be the investment of prosecutors? How are the laws actually going to be written? Some South American lawyers I know wrote a really interesting article comparing abortion activism in Brazil and Argentina. In Brazil, accompaniment is very controlled and, has really been, one might say, stomped on by the government, has been really targeted. In Argentina, long before the law, abortion was legalized at the end of 2020, activists were right out there. They had websites and they left their cards around in some of the consejerias, the places where women go when they think they may be pregnant, to get a pregnancy test and some counseling, and they were marching in the streets. They published their accompaniment statistics online. Right? So what was going on was not a secret in Argentina. The difference, but Argentina and Brazil, according to these two lawyers, had very similar laws about abortion. They had very different laws around abortion, right? So there's the question of how is abortion regulated, and then there's the question of are there other laws that can be brought into play against activists? And, before the Dobbs decision came down, there were a lot of prosecutions. There were, what certainly seemed like a lot. I don't remember the exact number. There's a report up on If, When, How about it. But there were a number of prosecutions, essentially for variations on self-managed abortion. And this was when abortion was legal, right? So they weren't charged with abortion. There are all kinds of other things you could charge somebody with. And some of them were horrifying, like abuse of a corpse. And a fair number of them got thrown out in court. But, so we are, the cross-border question is, yes, we are in very active dialogue. There are really robust models, powerful models that exist around the world for how to help people, even under conditions of a total ban. That there was a hotline in Chile when abortion was banned in Chile for any reason, including to save the life of the mother. Accompaniment emerged in Chile, which is sort of a higher level of support than a hotline. Accompaniment emerged in Chile before that total ban was overturned. There is accompaniment that happens in countries like El Salvador that brutally enforces its abortion ban, and where there are women in prison facing 20 or 30 years for true miscarriage, true spontaneous miscarriage. And the experience in parts, at least of El Salvador, has been that anybody who shows up in an emergency room with a miscarriage is presumed to be aborting. Could we end up there in Texas? Maybe. In Florida? Maybe. And then there's all the questions about how much space are the, right? So when we say what are activists going to do, that's a multi-layered question, right? There are the things that can be done and that people are learning about that can be done under any circumstances whatsoever and that people will do if they need to. Then there's a set of questions about how much space can be held open. Can New York, California, and Massachusetts hold open their shield laws? That opens up a lot of possibilities. Will there be a federal ban? How much can state governors resist, fight, hold open space for people? These are some of the dialogues of activism. that it's not like there's lawyers over here, there's legislators over here, and then there's activists over here. And among the activists, there are those who are visible, there are actions that take place in the street and actions that take place in areas of less visibility. So, there's so many moving parts to it, but people are actively in process of learning from feminist collectives that have been doing this under a wide variety of circumstances around the globe. And given the range of possibilities, even just in Latin America, never mind moving farther afield than that, partial bans, total bans, decriminalization, right? Like it exists, everything exists in Latin America. Anything may exist here, and there are strategies for working around it and for helping people have safe abortions, regardless of the law. So I think that there are a few really important things for people to hold as we move into the coming 4 years, and in particular, the coming 2 years. What really needs to happen, and what is happening, is that community-based activists need to be talking to each other. And that is happening all over the country. And there needs to be more of it. And people who are not currently connected and who are tearing their hair out or who are sitting there sinking into a heap and considering going back to bed for 4 years should instead find a way to connect with local activism. That people who study fascism say, you have to be connected locally. The struggle may happen at multiple levels, but you cannot plug in directly in a leap to nationally from your apartment in, Kensington, Brooklyn, or the south side of Chicago, or wherever your apartment is. Right, that you need to connect locally. And that's partly because we keep each other safe locally, much more than nationally. And if to the extent that we are really going to be fighting a regime that moves into full-on authoritarianism, we need to be able to keep each other safe. And that happens from your neighbors, not from somebody who's 1,000 miles away. And if it's not your state and it's not your neighborhood, don't try to fix it. When Dobbs came down, there were all sorts of people who were very well-meaning, northern safe state activists who were like, I want to do something. I can do civil disobedience. I'm not afraid. And I was like, I'm glad you're not afraid, but please don't put everybody else at risk. And if you go barging around like an elephant in, Mississippi, you're going to create risk for the activists in Mississippi. So just calm down. So connect locally. Have systems in place so that if something doesn't come flying and land on top of you, if the brown material does not hit the rotating blades in your neighborhood, then, you will have built great connections and, and you may find that your plans are useful for people even if ICE doesn't show up and Medicaid doesn't get revoked. But you need to be planning for those possibilities before they happen. So, yeah, work locally, get plugged in. There are local to national networks happening and being created by activists on the ground all over the country. So that's what we need to be doing. And then we will be prepared to find our way through. And I suppose I'll end with the Timothy Snyder quote that everybody likes. I think it's from him. Don't consent before you have to. Do not cooperate, do not consent in advance, do not cooperate in advance, do not give up in advance. Resist in advance.